So we're off to the carving stage of this project. I have the front panel of the vanity here, and I've attached just some simple packing paper to it, and I drew a pattern of what I'm looking for. This is supposed to be kind of like, you know, the bottom part of a coral mound, and then of course the coral growing up. Now there are a few extra drawings on here that were just kind of fleshing out some different ideas, but this is basically the pattern of what I'm wanting. I originally drawn it out on just a simple piece of paper and kind of, you know, turned it around side to side until I got the orientation that I was really wanting, because part of what I'm trying to do is that the top of this pattern is actually cut off from what I had on my paper. So the top of this coral is still going to continue up. The reason why is I'm going to be taking the board that's going to be the fronts of the drawers for the top section, and I'm going to attach it here after I do some of the carving in order to transfer the pattern and continue it on to there. And then I'll be carving that, so at least then it'll look continuous. It'll look like it's all part of the same thing. I actually want to pre-carve these sections here by lowering them down, and I'm going to use a planing bit for that. Now, if you've never used a planer bit, it's basically just a flat bottom bit, but then it has some curved up sides. They're generally also called bowl bits because you're going to use this to clean out the bottom of a bowl. So the nice part about these rounded edges is you don't tend to have any of that tracking like you would if you were using just a plain straight bit. So I'm going to use this to clear away most of this material here in between the parts that I want embossed, and then I'll be taking the sander to round the edges and then to shape them. Now here was the offcut of the major panel that I had, and what I did is this one here didn't get any pre-carving. What I did is I simply took the RAS-115 and then tinkered with the RO-90 to see how they were going to work with the different interface pads, speeds, grits, things like that. So actually this was kind of recarved, I don't know how many times in the process, but it's got exactly the feel that I'm looking for. And the feel is that it's just a soft, you know, if you put your hand on there, it's got an interesting texture to it, and at the same time you can see some of the pattern. Now of course here would probably be a flat with this one here coming up, but we're going to see that more as we go through the process. So now for routing this out, what I'm going to use is I'm going to use the OF-1400, but I'm also going to go ahead and use the OF-2200 since I have both of those routers. Now the only reason I'm going to do this is so that you can see the difference, the comparative difference on dust collection between them. I'll pick out two panels and do that with one of the routers, probably the 2200 because that's actually my preference for this one. It's got amazing dust collection. The OF-1400 is certainly no slouch in that area, so I'll do one of the panels with that as well so we can take a look and see how it goes. Hi, I'm Paul Marcel, and I have a router addiction. Now the shaping is going to be primarily done using the RO-90 and the RAS-115. Of course the RAS-115 is going to be doing the bulk of it because it's basically like a grinder in this mode. When I was doing my playing around with it, I was actually able to get some very good shaping very quickly. I didn't have to rely on using like rifflers or files or rasps along the way, although I do have some of those, so you know, if we need to finesse something, we're going to pull some of those out, and then at the end I'll make a list of all the tools that I used in the process. Now in transferring this over, I don't need to be super accurate. It's not like I'm going to stick carbon paper underneath it. Initially I'm just going to use this, you know, fat lead pencil, which is actually, this is intended to be really close to where the final definition is of the embossment, but I'm going to need to do my planing further out. So after I mark it with this pencil, I'm going to use this white sumisashi that I have in order to mark it about a ½ inch or so away, and that's where I'm going to go up to with the router. So I have the OF-1400 ready to go for the first panel. This panel here is actually the one that's on the left side of the bottom. I've chalked out the parts that are going to be removed. So you can see there's a lot to be removed. I've already set the router to be able to plunge down and leaving 3/8 material. I mean, that was pretty easy to do. I just took a 3/8 inch drill bit, put it here off the edge, and then plunge down and set my plunge depth to that. And I actually backed it off, I think, about a ½ millimeter just to make sure that I'll be sanding it down anyway. problem with the 2200 versus say the 1400 is they both have limited visibility in a certain way. The more dust collection you add, the least visibility that you're going to have. This one here has a cylinder that descends down and contains all the dust. Now, it's my option whether or not I release it, right? I could actually leave it up and get a little bit more visibility. Now, it turns out that because I have my garage door open and I have daylight coming in from that side, if I'm standing here, I'm seeing the daylight come through, and I could actually see pretty well. What I was having a difficult time seeing are the silly pencil lines on this mahogany. It was really tough to see. The white pencil, the white ink that I used yesterday honestly didn't mark it very well at all, so I couldn't use that. This board here is easily at least 60% gone now that I've taken this much material off. So knowing that it's going to want to move, this side here I already know from the previous board is going to start cupping in. There was more moisture on the inside of this board than on the outside, and it's dry out today. So it's going to want to cup inward. So by spraying some water on this side here, just enough to keep it so that any excess moisture, any moisture that it's wanting to stay even, it's going to get from the surface water. But I'm also going to put some on the back. Then I'll be tucking it in underneath a little tent that I made for the other board, and then all of them will sit there at the same time, kind of absorbing humidity, chit-chatting, that type of thing, and hopefully staying flat. I've always had good success with this in the past, so I really don't expect it to be an issue with this. And if there's a little bit of flattening that I need to do after the fact, it really won't be that difficult to do because the boards are honestly going to end up being fairly thin by the time these panels are fully done. So this one here, actually, before I put it underneath that tent, when I would press down on this corner here, the other side, you'd actually see it visibly pop up. So doing the thing where we put the humidity on both sides a little heavier so that there was more than enough to soak in and flatten out the board with the weights. It's all nice and flat now, so we can go ahead and start shaping this. So for initial carving, what I'm going to use is the RAS. If you haven't dealt with the RAS before, it's kind of an interesting tool. It's a rotary-only sander, so it doesn't have any eccentric motion or anything like that added to it. And it doesn't really have any dust collection here because the intention is that you're just stripping stuff off really heavily. So the thing that's nice is it's got this little catcher on there, and you turn this handle, so you're using it like a regular side grinder handle, but then you're able to spin this so that you can try catching the tangential dust that's flying off. Now, you're mostly going to catch fines in here as the vacuum is going to suck that up, but the chips are still going to fall on the floor. So at this point I actually have a couple panels already sculpted. This is the third panel. But what I wanted to explain are a couple things that I picked up along the way while doing sample boards and while doing the other boards, what makes doing some of the sculpting a little easier with the RAS. Now, not everybody's going to be doing anything like sculpting like this, but it might just be a trick that you can use for something else. Now, for getting into some of these grooves that are down here, I would place the sander on edge in order to run it along the square edge that I left from the pre-sculpting, trying to just angle it in and edge it. Now, of course, it's kind of awkward to try balancing it so close to the bottom without actually digging into the bottom. So what I noticed is that with the head turning, the head is going to be turning this way here. If this is the part that I have down on the bottom for the sculpting, the dust is actually going to get kicked towards this catcher. So that's the way I want to use it. I'm going to pull it along the edge this way here. So in a way, I'm going against the rotation of the sander, which is good. You don't want it climbing on the wood. But also, I use this bottom portion as kind of a foot. So I position this properly to keep the sander off the bottom, and I use this as almost like a guide bearing on the surface. So as I pull it across, I'm able to keep it at a good height without having to worry about accidentally dipping it down and significantly gouging into the surface, and then I have a lot of work to do to clean up. Now, the RO-90 was used mostly to clean up after all the kind of rough hogging. Initially, I thought, before I started doing test boards and playing with it, that I would end up using the interface pad the most, wanting to conform to these edges. But the problem is that these edges are actually pretty rough. And if I do this with the interface pad, what I found is that this conforms to the roughness and basically smooths it out, but it doesn't actually shape it. So while the interface pad is going to be fantastic once I'm done with the panels and I want to go up through the grits to go to higher grits without really taking away material just to get rid of the scratches, I didn't find it to be very useful at all at the stage where I'm at kind of with this panel, where I just finished doing the roughing out with the RAS. Now, what I did there is I have the regular pad for the RO-90. This isn't the hard pad, it's just a regular one. So it does flex fairly easily under some pressure, especially near the edges. So what I would tend to do is, if I wanted to soften this edge here, is that I would put the sander down, and as soon as I put it down, I push it hard into this edge. And as you're doing that, it'll ride up onto the edge, and this pad will conform mostly to this circle. But it actually has enough pressure in the middle that it's shaping it. Now, another thing that you can do when you're doing the pressing down, where you're actually having this conform, is in the center section here, I have a narrow channel. And while I don't have a way of putting this flat and ramming it up, it turns out that if I run the sander up on its edge and I push it down into the channel, both of these outside edges will conform to the sides of the channel, and I get about the same effect. Depending on how hard I press forward and the angle, I'll get more sanding of the flat that's between the channel. So if I want it to be pretty light, I can keep this at a shallow angle and press down, and I'll get both sides of the channel engaged. So this is where I'm at today. This gives you a little bit better idea of what I was looking for. I know some people have asked me along the way saying, I still don't really see what you're trying to do with the sculpting, and well, this is it. So this is the center section, and these two go onto the side. Now, what you're seeing today, this is pretty much straight off the sander and the RAS. This center section here hasn't been completed or touched in the least, actually, since initially hogging it out with the router, because this center section here has some special requirements for what I'm going to be doing with the drawers, and we'll talk about that more later. So it needs to be done after the rest of the panel is pretty much completely shaped. Now, I say completely shaped because this is still rough. I've finessed these edges, but what I want to do is, now that I have all three of them done, I want to be able to put them down and take a look and see what changes I want to make to the heights. For example, I could make this portion here lower than the rest to make it look like it's further behind, or I can add an extra edge like this perhaps up here to accent the fact that it's behind it. I can do things like that a little easier now that I have the three panels to look at. Plus, overall, I want to take the embossing down lower. I don't want it to be this pronounced. It doesn't have to come up and slap you, it just needs to be there as something interesting to look at and interesting to touch. So I'll be able to bring down all three panels at the same time a little bit easier by having them all together. So now, besides the sanders, I was able to use the sanders exclusively on the two outside panels. This panel here, I could use the sanders in most places except a couple small tight turns like I had here, just because of the design that I put on it. If you wanted to make the design more sander friendly, you could come up with a radius that would work nicer. This radius here happens to be just about the limit for the sanders. So for those, I ended up using these Iwasaki files. They're really nice planing files. They do, the cut that comes off of it is basically, you just have to touch it up with a little bit of sandpaper and you're done. So these are really nice. This is also an Iwasaki. It's a smaller half round that I have. And I'll put a link to these in my show notes on the blog. So if you're interested in taking a look at those. Now, in a couple places I did end up using the mandrel with the piece of paper, as I showed a little bit in the very first episode. Now the first episode I was using this interface pad on the RO-90. But I went ahead and used it, you know, as you're supposed to, in order to finesse a couple of these turns. It was just a little bit easier to use just the edge of this paper to be able to get into a couple of those turns to make it easier. So, for the most part though, it was all done with the RAS, so it's definitely something that would be worth giving a try if you ever want to try some sculpting like this.